Welcome to the Wordy Pair Podcast, your go-to hub for all things writing, world building, and the occasional dive into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We're breaking down the barriers between you and your next great story. Whether you're a seasoned scribe or just scribbling your first sentences, we've got something for you. We'll be discussing everything from crafting compelling characters to dissecting the good, the bad, and the downright bizarre in the world of fiction. Okay, this script says you guys are eccentric. Isn't that just a 3-syllable word for weird? No offense. So, whether you're in need of inspiration, a good laugh, or just a couple of weirdos to keep you company on your writing journey, you're in the right place. Thanks for tuning in to the Wordy Pair Podcast.
All right, hello everybody. Wordy Pair Podcast, as usual. I'm Rudy.
And is Justin.
Is Justin what?
Justin
Just
is.
in time?
I am, actually.
All right.
It's kind of easy to be since it's pre-recorded.
It wouldn't work very well if I just said things and then you tried to respond to them. I'd have to figure out where the pauses need to go and stuff. And that could get really hard, really difficult real quick.
And that's the kind of attention to detail you can expect from a wordy pair.
Yeah, us both recording at the same time. That's that's the bare minimum attention to detail you can expect from us.
Hey, it beats AAA.
That's true. So we came up with a topic of attention to detail as it pertains to writing, especially for this. But the inspiration was actually a video, kind of a meme video that's been going around over the last last week or so about that new game Avowed and comparing it to Oblivion and Skyrim.
Oh, is that what that video was about? I thought it was about the absolute decay of the AAA gaming industry.
Well, there is that too. Yes, I mean, yeah. The problem is that you can tell a really fun story, or you can have a really fun game that lacks attention to detail in a variety of ways, right? Like Loop Hero, right, is a fantastic game. We've both played that, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't have, water physics or whatever. It doesn't even have a persistent map. You just kind of generate a loop of roads, and then you just kind of play with that. There's not really attention to detail there, but the thing about it is that when you're trying to create some kind of an immersive world for someone to, kind of get into, whether they're getting into it by virtue of reading a story that is about this world, or whether they're kind of trying to, create a simulated reality where you can kind of spend some time in kind of a free-form way, right? Oblivion and Skyrim are open world. They kind of try to produce a world that, in some ways, at least, kind of mimics reality, right? The one thing that we saw in one of those videos was the NPCs in Oblivion and Skyrim will interact with each other. And it's not a super complicated thing. It's two characters walk up to each other. There's a randomly generated, hello line, randomly chosen out of several hello line. Then there's a couple of points where one character asks a question, another character chooses an answer from a couple of pre-scripted choices, and they kind of, go back and forth, and then they say goodbye, and then they walk away. Little things like that. Things like shooting an arrow into wood versus shooting an arrow into a metal or stone surface, right? It sticks into the wood, it bounces off of the stone or the metal in Oblivion and Skyrim, but in this, most recent Avowed game, it just kind of sticks no matter what the surface is. And sometimes it even sticks in a way that it's not actually touching the thing it's sticking into. And similarly, if you're writing a story and you want to have, some kind of world that the reader gets lost in, or even if you want to have some kind of thematic element, you need to make sure that the details of that story support that world and its consistency, or that thematic element and its consistency. So, it's one of those things, it's one of those art school things where it seems like a lot of writers of various media these days think that it is sufficient to simply like shout a very big idea, hint it's usually late stage capitalism, and then say that their particular work is good because someone shouted the idea late stage capitalism at some point in the story. Whereas the details of the world or the story might not, jive with that particular yelled idea. And the failure to make that jive happen makes the story, and therefore the thematic element, seem less plausible than otherwise it might. It's basically bad argumentation in fiction.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's. I like that you brought up the video game examples because it kind of reminds me. I don't know why, but like the character interaction thing you mentioned, and we can go all the way back to 1998 with Diablo 2, and there wasn't really any character interaction between the NPCs in that game, but it just sort of reminded me of how a lot of the interactions you have in the villages really make it feel like each of the four or five different zones that you visit with their own unique villages, they do feel like they're a part of this larger world that
like a coherent,
you venture out to, and there's monsters everywhere, but in this one place in this town where everyone is still kind of safe, it's like, they're watching the world fall apart and they're just kind of hanging out here trying to help the heroes how they can.
And keeping themselves safe and stuff.
I also can't help but think of, if you just stand next to Wariv in the first town, how he'll just keep saying hello. Hello there.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things that has been improved over, or for a time it was improving, right? And like, there's all kinds of cases where these interaction systems, these kind of automated, world building systems, failed in Oblivion and Skyrim. You can find cases where like two NPCs try to open the same door at the same time, and they kind of create some kind of weird noise as neither of them can complete their task, kind of thing. We have characters that walk into weird places or get stuck on geometry of the world. I mean, there's cases where these systems break down, but the effort is at least there, and it's like, hey, they at least tried to make it feel like you're walking through a town and you're not the only character in the town,
Yeah, and even when things mess up, it might break the immersion a little, but it's usually entertaining.
Yeah, there's that. It's also funny that one of the like art directors or something of Avowed was like, well, you can't do something interesting and new without some jank, and nothing in that game is interesting and new, and yet there's still jank. Whereas with Oblivion, there's genuine, reasonable reasons for there to be jank, because the things they were doing were actually new and different and, change the way that the player views the world. The early examples of this are stuff like NPC characters walking in circles in like Final Fantasy, or like the day-night cycle that characters had in, say, like Ultima 5, Ultima 6, Ultima 7. The characters would have a routine where they'd sleep in their bed, they'd wake up in the morning, they'd go to a certain place, they'd walk around that place for a while, they'd go over to another place, they'd walk around there for a while, they'd go back to bed, and that way it kind of creates the illusion of a real world. And
these things have been done for a pretty long time, too. I mean, how old is the Magic Candle? That was an old MS-DOS game.
Well, I mean, it was pre-MS-DOS. It was like an Apple II game originally. I mean, we're talking early 1980s. Yeah, and that's another really good example where they kind of created a living world where your hero is not the only, character with agency.
So
Magic Candle is really beautifully obscure, though, so awesome.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wouldn't have even known about that game if it hadn't been for you telling me about it, even though I had it on my computer when you told me about it, because I just went through an abandonware site and downloaded a bunch of stuff.
I mean, I haven't played that much of it, but it's got a lot of really interesting little hooks. Like, for instance, you get to build your party of 6 or 7 characters, I think, and you can choose a couple characters who their only job basically is to go into town and work at the jeweler's shop and just make money for you to finance the rest of your adventure. There's some interesting stuff that you can do in that game that nobody else really does. At least not as like a third person thing. Usually it's like, oh well, the player can do this if the player wants to make some extra money. But there's not usually like, yeah, you can set your party members to go do this thing too. That was kind of a neat rarity of the Magic handle itself.
Yeah, it added a bit of resource management to the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's a decently complex way of doing things too, because I was having trouble figuring it out in the beginning. Like, what am I supposed to do with these different characters? And it turned out that if you made mages in the game, you were actually supposed to leave them in town to learn for a while, so that they could actually do magic.
Right.
You had to send them off to Hogwarts.
Yeah, something like that. Have them spend some time in the library.
Yeah, this all circles right back to that attention to detail in writing, which there's a couple of ways to break this down. So one of the things that you brought up was and it was on the tip of my tongue and it slipped my mind, and now I don't know what I'm talking about.
Uh-oh.
And you said I had a good memory last week.
Well, maybe I forgot all the cases where you didn't have a good memory.
That of which there were many. Like, no, seriously, like I was thinking the exact thing I was going to say, and then I said one extra sentence, and it was like, wait, what was I going to say? Don't you love it when that happens?
You said circling back to attention to detail in fiction. You said there's a couple of different ways to go about this.
No, that's not going to help, because I had something in mind as I was saying that, and then I just sort of rambled on, and now here we are. You know what? Let's just start over. I'm turning it off. Okay.
I didn't even interrupt you. You interrupted yourself.
I know I did.
Okay. So go ahead.
Well, I guess that we can kind of, until I can remember what the heck I was going to say, we can look at some other things that this brings up, such as what does it mean to have attention to detail? Now,
okay, so that's a good question.
You don't obviously want to put every single thing that is in your mind on a piece of paper and then try to get someone to read it. It will be nonsense and chaos.
Okay, so well, you mean like all your thoughts on a particular setting, or do you mean in a broader sense?
Well, no. There's a level of what is the style of writing that you're doing, and what is it that you're focused on? What are the more important things? What are the less important things? Which things do not need to be there? Which things should only be there a little? Which should be there a lot? And which should be the focus?
There's actually so just to give kind of a little bit of pushback here. There's actually a little bit of, or I would say there's a decent amount of controversy to that particular statement, because, like, for instance, I haven't read them myself, but I've heard people talk about them, and like, apparently the Game of Thrones novels are actually very they get very deep into the descriptions of the settings. They kind of describe. I've heard someone describe it as Martin describes every apple on every plate in a banquet kind of thing, and so there's definitely a place for that kind of description if it can be done in a way that flows well and that the reader is like into, and it doesn't disturb the pacing. But yeah, in general, you're going to want to kind of curate things. But there's also the possibility, go ahead.
That's not quite the point. And in fact, I'm making almost the opposite point in that.
Okay.
Is that what makes reading Martin's books enjoyable? Is it that he goes into such deep detail, and is it interesting the way that he presents it? I mean, I was going to use an example of, like, a lot of what I write, I focus more on the characters, the character development, and dropping tidbits of world building as I'm writing.
Sure.
And I don't really go into hyper detail on what's in each setting of the story, because usually the most important thing in the story is the character interactions and the character building.
Yeah.
Or the fight scenes, I guess, in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
But that's just one style. That's the one I prefer, and the good guy would not have been nearly as good if I had been focusing on how many apples were on a plate in parts of the story. Yeah. Whereas that's probably one of the things that makes it fun to read. The what is it, Song of Fire and Ice, or something.
I mean, there's a few different books. I don't know what the names of all of them, but I think Song of Fire and Ice is one of them.
I mean, I definitely, as a reader, I wouldn't want every single book I read to read either like my books or like an overly descriptive book like Martin apparently writes. I wouldn't
Yeah.
want everything to read like a Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman Dragonlance novel, even though I love those,
Hmm.
because Jurassic Park would not be as entertaining in that style, and
Right.
neither would the Discworld books. So there's when you're talking attention to detail, that doesn't mean okay, you've got an idea, you write what you want to write, and then you look at it and you say, oh, I didn't put enough. I mean, you might have to do a bit of that to polish it up,
Yeah.
but you don't want that to be, you don't want to erase the focus of what you've done in order to glorify something that isn't quite as relevant to the story.
Okay,
You
so you're
need
bringing
to.
up a good point here because I think there's two elements that kind of determine how much detail you want to put in any particular passage. And one is what you just said is focus, right? Like if we want to focus on the characters having a conversation, then we're going to focus on that and we're going to kind of let some of the details of what's in the room go to the side. And the other reason that you want to kind of temper your enthusiasm for writing things in detail is pacing. If you're in an action scene, well, you're not going to talk about all the different blades of grass that the two characters are stepping on as they run toward each other to get into a fight, right? So those are two elements, reasons why you want to kind of limit your attention to detail, of setting. For focus, it's moving your attention to detail from one point to another. For pacing, it's removing some attention to detail for the purposes of faster writing or faster action.
Yeah, it's that sounds perfectly reasonable to me. I mean, just imagine. Okay, so imagine you're watching a Monty Python sketch, except
Yeah.
as soon as they start telling all the jokes, the voices become very muffled, and there's a tinnitus ringing playing through your speakers, and the perspective goes to one of the side characters just staring off into the distance at like a mountainside or
Well,
something.
I
You
mean,
don't
that
you don't
sounds
want
like
the
something that
focus
Python
of.
might do, actually.
Well, as a joke, yes, but you
Yes.
don't want the focus of a Monty Python sketch to be the guy that's staring off in the distance at a beautiful mountain,
Yeah.
while you can just barely hear the jokes in the background. You don't want to muffle the things that are important.
Right, right.
No muffling. Don't muff it.
Like, don't muffle it or don't muff it?
I meant don't muffle it. Well, no, I meant don't muff it, but it sounded funnier to say muff it, so I said muff it.
Well, but muff is way like if you wanted to give advice to a writer, to a novice writer, what would you say about attention to detail? What would you tell them to, like? Would you first look at what they've written? I mean, probably you would first look at what they've written so far. But like, what kind of conditions can we think of that might be helpful to someone who wants to, kind of determine whether they've got too much or too little attention to detail in something they're writing?
Well, one of the things that I definitely noticed from a lot of writing that
Mhm.
I have seen that I feel isn't very polished,
Yeah.
a writer will write something that is interesting and is going
Yeah.
somewhere, but they get distracted from it and they kind of
Mm.
circle around and come back to it in a way that makes it less interesting than if they hadn't gotten distracted.
Yeah.
I would say that is definitely a novice thing, and that, I mean, that's something that you do kind of have to do a lot of writing to get used to not doing.
So it's like interrupting something happening to go off into something not relevant to what's happening. Is that a fair assessment, or am I
Not
missing it
maybe
up?
not quite. Not it's not to say it's not relevant. It's that
Hmm.
sometimes you have to reorganize how you present these things so that you don't lose the focus of the narrative.
Okay.
So I don't know if I can think of an example off the top of my head. You're. Oh, okay. Well, let's take an extreme example. Let's take the
Okay.
example
Sure.
of the Netflix show that gives you an episode with a character that you're and a storyline for that character that you're really getting into, and then you go to the second episode and they're focusing on an entirely different character, and it takes them 3 episodes to get back to that last character.
Oh, okay. I see what
This
you're
is
saying. Yeah.
brutally annoying.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Like,
it's not just it's not just annoying. It like, imagine that you only had enough time to watch one episode a week or one episode every 3 days, you would forget the tension of that episode that you were really into by the time you get through those other 3 episodes, perhaps.
Yeah, and I don't think there's... I mean, there's definitely situations where you can do that. A lot of people write books that tackle things from multiple characters' perspectives. And
Sure.
it's important to understand that you need to create a flow of events where if you are going to interrupt something that's happening with one character, you need to have... You kind of have to build a bit of intuition for how to maintain the suspense of where you left off for that character, which can be done.
Yeah.
I mean, you can create a situation where something happens to a character and then you have to jump to another group of characters for 2 or 3 chapters. But when you come back, it all kind of circles around so that it doesn't just feel like you didn't know what to write for that character in that moment and you'll get back to it when you feel like it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Well, like, the thing I'm thinking of is, like, imagine
I mean,
that there's
we
some
discussed
kind of...
this with the Death Cycle, the Deathgate
Yeah.
Cycle books.
Right.
But you were saying...
Well, no, I was just going to say, like, if you're going to interrupt... So there are going to be places in your story where the pace slows down, because maintaining a constant high pace can kind of either tire out or numb the reader, right? So you're going to have some action, then some reduction in action. You know, and when you have that kind of movement, you kind of end up with natural places to put some of these extra details. And so whenever you find that your pace is slowing down, you can kind of be like, oh, this is a good place to put in a little detail about the world that they're in or something like that. And you kind of pepper those throughout the story. And that way you kind of, you know, do a kind of a patchwork job of slowly building up some world building elements, or even like including thematic elements. Like, you know, say your story that you're writing, you know, the idea that you really want to get across is X, right? Then you're going to want to put little details that serve that idea X at various places. And these places where the pace slows down are a good place to kind of insert things without damaging any action. The other thing I wanted to say was that I'm thinking about like a case where a character is up against some kind of restriction for like a time restriction, and they don't have the tools to solve the problem that they're facing right now. And so the reason, for instance, that you might jump to a different group of characters is for that group of characters to get the tools that your first character needs to solve his problem to him. And that would be a good way, for instance, to keep that tension ratcheted up, is that these characters know that they're kind of in a race against time to get these tools to this other guy so he can solve this other problem. If you're going to change perspectives, one way to ensure that the reader doesn't lose sight of the tension that you jumped away from is to kind of make that tension be a part of why you jumped away, right? That's kind of a basic reason why you would do that, and a basic method that you would use to maintain that attention on the situation that you had to jump away from, is to make the thing that you jump to in service of the thing that is generating the tension in the first place. I'm trying to come up with like a generalized version of how you might do this, and that's one method. Can I don't know. Does that sound reasonable, or you have anything to add to that?
It sounds reasonable. I think we could probably, since we started on video games, we can circle back around to another video game to kind of
Sure.
give a comic example of
Okay.
shifting where the narrative is taking place.
Yeah.
So in the game Earthworm Jim, you start off in a pretty simple level that shows you the basics of how to play the game.
Yeah.
And you get close to the end of the level, and there's this little incident that takes place where there's a refrigerator hanging by a rope for no apparent reason,
Mhm.
and a cow standing on a branch that is hanging over a ledge underneath the refrigerator.
Okay.
And when you hit the refrigerator, it falls from the rope, lands on the branch, and the cow flies up into the sky. and this big message pops up on the screen that says cow launched.
Okay.
Now, if ever there was a good example of how to do timing for, at the very least, comedic purposes, this is a good one.
Okay.
Because you go through this entire game, you race a sentient crow, you save puppies from being flung out of windows, you go through level after level fighting all sorts of weird monsters. Crawling around as a worm, jumping around in your spacesuit. You get to the end and you fight this giant larval queen thing spitting out eggs. And at the very end of the game, when you finally finish fighting the boss, it looks like there's nothing you can do about actually finishing her off. And then a cow lands on her head. And it takes a second for this to process, because there's a lot of layers to what happened there. First off, they presented this little tidbit at the beginning of the game. They gave you a gigantic flashing red message that said, cow launched.
Yes.
As if it was in preparation for something. But at the time, you couldn't possibly be considering that. You're just like, okay, the cow was launched. And as you play, you start to think, all right, that was just for comedy purposes. Which, I mean, it was.
You never do it again throughout the game?
No, it happens at the beginning of the game. Nothing ever happens. I think there's 2 or 3 scenes throughout the game where you see in the background a very tiny cow flash past as you're playing through certain levels.
Okay. So occasional callbacks. Yeah. Good to note.
Yeah, so you get to the end of the game, and then the cow lands on the big baddie and finishes her off.
Yeah.
And that's one heck of a setup, considering it's just supposed to be a platforming video game with a little bit of hijinks here and there. I mean, it was kind of like, it was very 90s with its sense of humor.
Yeah.
You know, the earthworm equivalent of fart jokes, I guess, but...
Yeah.
But the cow thing was utterly brilliant, to have you go through the entire game and have to finish it just to get the payoff for that giant red flashing cow-launched joke.
Yeah.
I mean, you go through the whole... I mean, you've forgotten about it by the time you get to the end of the game, and then they just throw it right back in your face. You're like, oh, the cow was launched for a reason. Okay.
I see. Interesting.
Which just makes it that much better, because then you're left with the mystery of, wait, did Jim know this was going to happen the whole time?
Did he plan this? Yeah. No, I mean, that kind of thing is a really good idea to have. I mean, it's like you create a situation, and you kind of give something a fanfare, and then you kind of let it taper away, and you let the reader or the player forget about it, only to bring it back later on in such a way that's like, oh. There was that was a setup.
Well, it's the narrative that we're kind of circling around to the whole narrative idea, and the narrative of the cow was interrupted for the entirety of the story,
right?
Only to come back at the end in a very satisfying way, just to illustrate the point that there are many ways that you can write something in which you pull away from part of the narrative that, when you, on reflection, ends up being an incredibly interesting part of the full story.
Okay.
And you come back to it in a very satisfying way for the people who are supposed to be entertained by this. In this case, the game players, but in the case of writing, your readers.
Yeah, so the thing that I want to mention is that, maybe this isn't the right place to mention this, but you're familiar with the concept of, what's it called? Chekhov's gun?
Am I?
Probably. It's the notion that if in a narrative you put a gun on the table, then that gun needs to do something, kind of thing.
Yeah.
There should definitely be... It would be silly to say that you put things in there without a purpose, necessarily. But at the same time, if every single thing is like a setup and then a callback, or like a setup and then a payoff, then you're also kind of going to kind of condition the reader to always expect that payoff. Whereas if you pepper in like occasional details and make it so that, some of these details clearly aren't going to have any other particular payoff. Some of them do, some of them don't. You kind of create an anticipation in the reader where the reader is asking himself questions. Like, oh, well, is this particular detail going to mean something later on? And, like, part of what might keep a reader going is knowing that they're not sure whether everything is going to have a payoff. Because if everything that you say, leads to a payoff, then that can become kind of predictable in some ways, where it's like, well, he talked about a gun, so someone's going to shoot somebody with that gun. Oh, he talked about a horse, so someone's going to ride the horse. He talked about a fire, so someone's going to, save someone from the fire. Whereas, if you add more details, then you add more details that don't necessarily have a payoff, which helps to make the reader not focus on the things that are setups for payoffs.
Well, in the mystery books, we would call it a red herring.
Well, I mean, it's a red
similar
herring
in
is
concept.
it's similar, but a little bit more benign in the sense that, like, it's just like, well, I described 3 things about this planet that they're on, and 2 of them are just like, hey, it's a neat fact, right? It's a cool thing. And the third one is also a cool thing, but it also happens to be a cool thing that they use to their advantage later on in the story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, let's make it a bit more succinct. Let's
okay,
go ahead and say that we talked about maintaining the focus on what's important, but there's also merit in removing focus from some things only to present it as an important piece later on.
Okay.
I mean, that could be in the form of a red herring. That could be in the form of an important piece of information presented between multiple pieces of not so important information.
Yeah.
It's kind of the bunny hair clip in the character's on the character's notebook or whatever that we mentioned in, I believe, the Slayers episode.
Yeah, I think so.
You have a character that there's just this extra little detail about them that makes it a little bit more of a real world that you're reading about.
Yeah.
So you get these pieces of information, like the 3 pieces of information that you mentioned, and 2 of them aren't really all that important, but they also sort of do the job of letting you know that the entire world doesn't just consist of the things you need to know for the narrative to happen.
Yeah. You really want to. Well, so yeah, the point one is that, like, the world, it doesn't merely consist of objects that have a purpose in the story, but that there are things outside the things that have a direct purpose in the story that exist, and that the characters might notice or remark about. Like, but then the other thing is that crap. Now I did it. I lost it.
Well,
yeah. Go ahead.
If you're in a moment where you have a big cliffhanger, or you've just presented an important piece of a narrative, it is not necessarily in one's best interest to just completely jump away from that out of the blue to something totally different. So would you like to hear this week's Japanese folklore tidbits?
Yes, let's do that.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and have a look at Hoderi and Hori. We have a hunter and a fisherman in this case, and the hunter and the fisherman are like, hey, why don't we try doing what the other one does for some reason X that we don't really get in this narrative. So yeah, just like let's just relate this to what we're talking about right now. If you do want to get away with just having whatever you want in your story, just make it as confusing and chaotic for the reader as possible, possibly in the form of a Japanese bit of mythology or folklore, because it seems like you can play pretty fast and loose with this stuff. But
the thing about writing something that's that chaotic is that it might turn the reader off, right? That's what you want to avoid.
Right. And it's interesting that we chose this route of doing this, because we just switched lanes to this story. I gave the character names and everything, and now we're not talking about the story. So
well, let's talk about the story then.
Yeah, let's go ahead. I did have to open the book to look at the names again, but essentially you've got this hunter and this fisherman that are brothers, and they're like, okay, I'm gonna hunt. One says I'm gonna hunt, and you're gonna fish today, and so they exchange their tools of the trade, and the fisherman comes back with the hunter's bow and says, here you go, here's your bow back. Now where are my fish hooks at? Yeah. And the hunter says, oh boy, so I lost the fish hook. I'll give you a new one and a better one to replace it. And the fisherman's like, no, I want that fish hook. I don't know why. It's a Japanese bit of folklore.
It has sentimental value.
Yeah, it's a sentimental fishhook, which is why you give it to your brother who doesn't fish to fish with, because it's not like you snag things in the weeds every time you fish anyway. So
Right.
so yeah, that worked out well. So the brother's like, all right, tell you what, I'll give you like 100 fish hooks, and the fisherman brothers, no, I want the fish hook. I want that fish hook. And so this irks the brother, and he says, all right, fine, I will see what I can do. So he goes to some old dude by the sea, says, hey, I need a fish hook. I need my brother's fish hook. What do I do to get my brother's fish hook back? And this guy, I don't know, it might have been a god or something, doesn't matter. Kind old man by the name of Shikotsutsu no Oji, which just means the old man Shikotsutsu. So, which is apparently Salt Sea Elder in their translation, which actually is pretty close.
Okay.
Yeah, that is very close. So this old man is like, okay, well, yeah, let's take care of this. And now this is where it gets weird, because we're right back to Grimm's fairy tales. The old man makes a basket, tells the guy to get in. I don't know why this is a worldwide concept, but apparently it's not just the egg baskets from Grimm's fairy tales now. Japanese folklore also has the travel basket. And he tosses the fisherman, or the hunter, he tosses the hunter into the sea in this basket, which is fine, because in Japan everyone can breathe underwater, which is only adding to my theory that perhaps everyone in Japan was replaced by robots long ago. We don't know. We have no way of testing this. We just have to make assumptions at this point. So this guy sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and he gets there, and there's this gigantic palace, battlements, turrets, you name it, it's got it. Big old stately towers. And this god of the sea shows up and goes, "Oh, well, we're gonna have to let this stranger in." And oh geez, I believe his daughter his daughter appeared, wanted to marry this hunter.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the god of the sea is like, all right, we'll prepare an 8-fold cushion. Let him in. And it's like, okay. They never mention the 8-fold cushion again. I have no idea what part of that plays in the story. It is literally like, it is something. It is the Lovecraftian Elder Things version of Chekhov's gun, because it plays no role whatsoever. The god of the sea calls all the fishes of the sea once he hears the story of the fish hook that's missing, and is a little bit overboard in my opinion, but that's what happens. Calls all the fishes of the sea, says, let's find this fish hook. They fail to find the fish hook. Every single fish in the sea of Japan, which is 90% nitrogen, part oxygen, and maybe a little bit of moisture in the air because you can breathe it.
Yeah.
They can't find this fish hook, which is understandable because it's a fish hook. And then one fish happens to remember, oh yeah, some mermaid chick had like a thing on her face. It's like, okay, you could have led with that. So they bring her in. Sure enough, it's a fish hook. So they take the fish hook and give it to the guy. He's like, cool, I've got the fish hook. He then proceeds to spend 4 years living underwater, married to this princess. But then starts to think of his brother and says, oh, well, I should give him his fish hook back. And I do kind of miss the old bloke. So he goes back up to the surface after his wife is like, yeah, make a home. I'll meet you there, probably having your kid. So you got that to look forward to. Off with ye now. He goes up to the surface, gives the fish hook back to his brother, but not before, and this is the part that you're going to love. The god of the sea told him when he goes up, yeah, here's the fish hook, but here's a thing, and if you do something with this thing, it can raise the tide or lower the tide. And so if your brother is not repentant of being angry at you, do this and drown him. But if he is, then do this and don't drown him. And it's like, wait, where is this coming from? When did I ever say I wanted to drown him? So he goes back up to the surface, gives his brother the fish hook. The brother has no questions whatsoever about where he's been 4 years. He's just like, I'm so sorry I got angry at you about this fish hook. And all is well with the world. Hunter's wife comes back up to the surface, moves in with him just long enough to have his child, and is like, okay, here's your kid. I'm going back to the sea. No questions are ever asked. He's just like, yep, cool. And that apparently is the story of Hodari and Hori, the fisherman and hunter duo brothers.
I see.
That I'm trying to discern what the moral of this story is. Is it like, I don't know if it's, if you're angry at someone, wait 4 years and then,
maybe
reconcile
it's
with
like,
them.
don't sweat the small stuff. There we go. There we go.
Your wife will give birth and then run off. There's a moral here somewhere. Women are fickle. That's the moral of this story.
That doesn't sound like it's the moral of this particular story. It sounds like the fisherman was fickle. It's
There's
like,
literally... Oh my god, maybe that's the moral of every Japanese story. Everyone's fickle.
Yeah.
Did we just crack the code?
Even the sun is fickle in Japanese folklore.
Yeah, the sun is like, oh, this guy's stomping on my rice fields. I'm gonna go bugger off to a cave.
We just discovered the fundamental cultural aspect of Japanese folklore: fickleness.
Wow, we're gonna have to test this theory as we continue with these interludes.
Yeah,
because the cows coming home. Oh my god, was that the joke they were making in Earthworm Jim? Till the cows come home? Okay, maybe not. Maybe that's a bit... Maybe I'm stretching it a bit there.
You're probably stretching... I mean, they did a lot of funny things with cows in Earthworm Jim. Like, there were I think it was Earthworm Jim 2, there was a series of endings where different characters were replaced with cow.
I don't remember that, but it
was hilarious. Like it was like, and so finally, there's like, a text crawl on the screen, like, and so finally, Earthworm Jim has saved what's-her-face with the blah, 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 and defeated the evil so-and-so, yada, yada, yada. And then it, like, stops, and, like, Clue style, it, like, rewinds, and one of the characters is now replaced by a cow. And, like, the text also is, like, stylized for the cow as they retell the story with the cow in a new position. And then they keep doing that with all the characters until all the proper nouns in the epilogue are turned into cow.
I like it. Maybe I didn't finish that one. That might be why.
I finished it once, and so I'm probably getting some of the details a little bit wrong, but that is the gist of what happened. So what you can see here is that our addition of details about Japanese folklore and Earthworm Jim 2 make it sound like we're living in a real world, when actually we're in a fictional world, and those two things are both setups for things that you're going to get later on. Or not.
Said Rudy, placing a gun on the table for no reason. Or a fishhook. I don't know. Well, you can pretty much place whatever you want anywhere in a Japanese story, and
I'm just surprised that, like, this mermaid got a fishhook in her face, and everybody was like, nobody seemed to, like, care until.
I like to picture that she was the one walking through the halls, like, anyone seen a fishhook? We're looking for a fishhook. Ugh. Folklore will never not be entertaining.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I don't know. Modern folklore probably wouldn't.
Well, that's
modern kind of the folklore thing, though. It's like, look at what happened. Now, it's safe to say that most people are probably capable of writing. Maybe even anyone, if they sit down and learn how to do it. Practice doing it a bit. It is not the most difficult thing to do. It is not on the level of being an engineer. There's a lot of people that will talk about writing like, oh well, this is tradecraft. It's like, a lot of people do it. It's not exactly the hardest thing to do. It's a job you can do sitting down and being patient.
Well, there's an aspect of subjectivity to it too, right? Like where, for an engineer, if he builds a bridge and the bridge collapses, it was a bad bridge. But there are going to be people who write stories, and people are going to go back and forth for eternity about whether that story was a good story or a bad story. I mean, that's one of the things that I think is kind of like, I mentioned earlier, someone in the story shouts late-stage capitalism, and then that makes it a good story kind of thing. We have this kind of like art school pretentiousness going on, where like the presence the presence of an idea in the story is more important than the ability of the story to entertain, inform, intrigue, whatever. Where like, this story talks about this particular issue, and therefore it is important and good, where important and good are both capitalized, and we will put this story on a pedestal right next to, a banana duct taped to a wall as evidence of great art, right?
Right.
Where, and you get people who are really like flippant, where like I look for thematic elements in the stories that I read, and I'm not so interested in these petty world-building elements that are so fickle and pointless. And it's like, if you want to write an essay about some particular, philosophical idea, go ahead and do that. The fact that you took the idea for a philosophical essay and shoehorned it into a story does not make it a good story. And it doesn't even necessarily make it a good argument for or against that particular philosophical idea.
And you say shoehorn, but usually they rip out the soul as they're doing it.
Well, that's obvious. Yeah. They would have to do that. Otherwise it wouldn't fit.
Right.
Because, again, subtlety as an art is dead with some of these kind of, I don't know, art school pretentious people.
I'm going to go ahead and say that I feel incredibly strongly about this particular aspect. Now, picture that you are in the room when someone presents the idea of the long-running cow gag for the start and ending of the Earthworm Jim game.
Yeah.
And there's like one guy standing across the room that drops his clipboard and just looks up like, oh my God, that's brilliant. And then everyone else is like, well, what does this really add to the game? I mean, we're just making a platformer here. We don't need this silly cow joke in here. And it's like 5 people just like, no, we don't need it. This is, let's not add this to the game. This is just a waste of our time. And, it takes time to program. And those are the bad writers. Yeah. All of those people are the bad writers. They're the ones that are currently being put in these writing positions for these modern games that have no soul.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's people that they ended up in a position where there's other people who, or at least there used to be other people who could write, but they hounded them to put all their dumb ideas into stories and ended up driving those people away until the only people left in the industry were writers by title only because they happen to be the only ones left at the studio that would take the writing job.
Writers in name only, or winos.
Yeah. But largely this is what happened. You have situations like that, or you have situations where through a series of clicks and nepotism, people and their friends ended up in high-profile writing positions that they cannot possibly justify having. And then they try to write things, and then they try to sell them. And for a while, it works because everyone's like, what happened? This studio used to make good games. I mean, this is just a fluke, right? Maybe the next one will be good. And so the next one does okay. And this might happen a couple of times, and then finally everyone's like, there's no one there that can write. This all sucks. And there's no one there that can program either. People are slowly starting to learn that modern programming largely consists of people that know how to use Unreal Engine but don't know how to modify anything in it. And that's kind of where we are today. I mean, the video you showed me that prompted us to talk about this was Avowed against Skyrim in terms of what... Well,
there were 2 videos, one with Oblivion and one with Skyrim.
Yeah, and the Oblivion one is even more ridiculous because Oblivion is, 20 years old?
19, I believe, yeah.
Yeah, a 19-year-old game versus a brand new game, and it just destroys it in terms of quality, writing, interaction.
So that video didn't tell us anything about the writing of the game, story plot-wise, right? Like, again, you can write a really interesting story and present it in a game that doesn't have a lot of, polish, right? Like,
that may be, but I feel again, I'm on solid ground in guessing this one.
Sure, but part of creating an open world game experience is that kind of attention to detail in the world building. Things, when they're thrown into the water, should splash if you have that technology. Arrows should not penetrate solid metal, unless they're you might even have, flags for this is a magic arrow. It does penetrate metal kind of thing.
Oh my God, that is even worse though. Cause the level of inattention to detail that we're talking here is literally just checkboxes in Unreal Engine.
Yeah.
So it's it's not even something that needs to be heavily modified in most cases. I mean, I'm sure there are collision detection protocols that can be turned on and off with a checkbox in Unreal Engine.
I mean, possibly. I have no idea. I've never used it, so.
I mean, I don't know, but we know that the engine is capable of these things. It's just that it might require a little bit of work and a little bit of thought and a little bit of attention to detail. And the lack of all 3 of those things is a sign that there's something seriously wrong
in the in the art direction and engine handling parts of that game studio. It's a big decay because Avowed was Obsidian, right? And Obsidian was freaking Fallout New Vegas, which is heralded as the best 3D Fallout game that there is, and the attention to detail in that game is pretty high, especially from a writing perspective. There's a lot of branching paths. There's a lot of different things that characters can react to. There's a lot of different ways that your player character's intelligence or strength or luck or perception affect what lines you can provide to different NPCs, what kinds of plots you can get into, stuff like that. Like, it's one of those games where there was a ton of attention paid to detail in the writing, and a decent amount, at least, attention paid to the gameplay and the world building. The world itself is pretty self-consistent, and the factions kind of interact in meaningful ways. There's some interesting world building stuff going on in that game, and apparently they just wiped out all of the people that were responsible for that detail, between then and now. And when did Fallout New Vegas come out?
Oh, wasn't that shortly after Oblivion?
I'm gonna look it up.
Yeah, so I have a theory as to that, too, and my theory is essentially... Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Fallout New Vegas came out in 2010. So it is 15 years old, almost.
So 1 year more than Skyrim?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what is happening there is that the first bad thing, maybe not even necessarily a bad thing, but the first thing that happened is a lot of the really good programmers got pushed out in lieu of decent programmers who were also really good at manipulating Unreal Engine. And I think we've hit the point where the people who are decent at manipulating Unreal Engine have been pushed out in lieu of people who know how to use Unreal Engine, but are friends or politically aligned with the people that hire.
Okay.
And so we've got a group of people now that aren't good at manipulating Unreal Engine, but know how to use it. And so we don't have either the programming or the software knowledge base left in the industry in AAA to be able to make the incredible games we had just 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I think that's the stage we've hit, and I think the next stage is straight up people are just going to hand you things from the base Unreal Engine development kit or development platform, and everyone's going to be able to see it for what it is, and that'll be the end of a lot of these AAA studios. I mean, most of them are going the way of the dodo already. It's kind of written in the wall in the case of I don't see Ubisoft recovering from where they are right now. I believe that they're going to be sold off in multiple parts to multiple different studios, and 8 of the 10 studios that buy them up are probably going to be studios that are also going to fail in the near future. So there might be 1 or 2 really good winners in all of this, and the nice thing about that is there's so few good programmers hanging around at this point that they'll probably hire the good programmers. That's my hope.
The other thing about there being so few good programmers in AAA games is that a good programmer can run circles around them with much smaller budgets and make a game that people love, despite the lack of $50 to $100 to $200 million to burn in that project.
Yeah, but I mean, if only that was happening somewhere, anywhere, then maybe we would have a chance at Oh wait, indie games are doing great.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a lot of good indie games out there. There's no reason to even look at AAA. There's so many good indie games.
Well, I mean, you can look at AAA, but I wouldn't recommend buying it for the most part.
Yeah, I don't know of anything that's come out in the past decade that I really cared about outside of... I mean, I don't know, was Deep Rock Galactic was made by an independent studio, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm really struggling to think of something...
I mean, there's the Yakuza series. So those are still pretty good. There's Unicorn Overlord is maybe not AAA, but AA. There are still examples of good studios that are producing things that are good, but unfortunately most of them are no longer in the United States.
Cool. Now
there's some good European studios that are still kicking. So there's a like a Gothic remake, which looks like it might be good. So who knows? But like this is. I mean, we don't want to necessarily get into the economics. This is kind of a self-correcting problem.
Yeah.
Where where a studio makes a bunch of money because they do good things, and then they stop doing good things and they lose a bunch of money and they go out of business. That's natural. But like again, let's for the end here, let's roll it back to writing and kind of summarize here. Like attention to detail, it's important, and simply shouting a big idea at the start of your book doesn't justify that idea. Even if you're all in on themes or everything, you still need the rest of your story to serve that theme if you're going to do it. And if you don't have attention to detail, the rest of your story isn't necessarily going to follow your theme, and you're going to end up with this muddled mess. And then if you're a good writer and you aren't all in on themes or everything, then you're going to want to create a world that your reader can immerse himself or herself into. And in doing that, you're going to need to have a good sense of what details to add, where to add them, how to add them without, messing with the pacing of the story. And details aren't just world building, they can be details about the characters, things that the characters like, things that the characters dislike, things that the characters believe in, things that the characters think about each other. These are all details that make a story more fun to read if they're done properly. And it's one of those things that's kind of hard to teach a crash course in an hour, but there's
you essentially want to make a basket, a nice cozy basket full of eggs, and stick your reader in that basket. Make it a nice enticing basket so the reader will just jump right in.
Yeah.
So that you can then drown your reader in entertainment.
I was gonna say carry them off to another world, but yours works too.
Yeah, I feel like mine is mine had a little bit
you're
more.
mixing metaphors here because you said egg basket, but like it wasn't necessarily an egg basket that happened in the Japanese.
It was a basket. You could put eggs in it. You got a basket, you got eggs. I mean, unless it's a really tiny basket, you can put some eggs in that basket. Or if it's like an ostrich egg, I guess that wouldn't work either. But the point is, you're fitting a human being in the basket. I'm guessing you can put some eggs in there. I don't know how the eggs managed to not break. It's Grimm's fairy tales. That's where the magic happens. Maybe.
Well, like that's the thing is that like you can engineer a basket so that like the eggs are held separate from each other and stuff like that. You create kind of like a lattice, and you can do that, and that makes it easier to carry a large quantity of eggs without breaking them when you happen to step on a rock on the path, right? Whereas like when you're talking about the boat, the basket in the story, in the Japanese story, I'm thinking more of like a large boat-shaped basket that fails as a boat in every way because it's water permeable.
We're giving people advice on how to stay focused.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, we can lead by counterexample, right?
Right. Comedic counterexample.
Comedic counterexample.
But really, drown your readers.
In entertainment.
In entertainment. Didn't I say
Not
that?
literally. Don't literally. You did the first time, but not the second time. I just wanted to make it clear.
Well, I suppose job. I don't want to say. Well, we're going to say job medium rare.
Sure. I mean, we've certainly included a lot of details. There's something to be asked for. There's something, as far as organization goes, it may be wanting, but hopefully people, if they listen to this whole thing, will be able to be like, okay, so I've got the advice to add details, to keep an eye on my pacing, to keep an eye on not making it so that every detail is a setup for a payoff. And that way the reader is still guessing a little bit about what things are going to pay off later on. Details in world, details in theme, details in character, these are all important. Hopefully someone can make some usefulness out of this. Maybe not. Maybe they'll just get a good laugh. And if that's all that happens, then that works too.
I mean, it all kind of works, and it's just important that you don't get too caught up in what people think you should do as a writer, and you write something that's entertaining. That is seriously the number one rule.
Uh-huh.
If you want to write something...
I mean, that's an entirely different topic. We could do a whole episode on just that.
It's a question of, do you want to write something that people will want to read? That's the only real question. Many people are making television shows, video games, and books right now that nobody wants to read, watch, or play.
Yeah.
Don't be that person.
Right. I mean, unless they offer you a lot of money to be that person.
And don't take that in the sense that there's certain things you can and can't write. If you want to write a book about a subject, not even a fictional book, just even like a textbook about a subject that you are interested in, this is the nice thing about doing that. When you write about something that you enjoy, it's practically guaranteed that you are not the only person in the world that's going to enjoy that. And if you don't believe me, look at some of people's hobbies on YouTube. My God, the number of bird watchers, the number of falconers, the number of people that will sit around talking about Chinese knockoff video games, the number of people that will watch those videos. I mean, like me, minus the bird ones. I don't know where the bird ones came from. I think someone got bit by a bird recently, and I was just like, oh yeah, birds.
And watching of birds.
Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of people have very, very, to me, boring hobbies, and there's just hundreds and thousands of videos about these hobbies on the internet. So it's like, okay, well, lots of people actually like that stuff. So
yeah,
it's I mean, it's a question I've seen pop up on writing Twitter before, where people are like, do you write what you like to read or what you think your audience would like? It's like, well, that if you write what you like to read, there's almost certainly an audience out there. Unless you like to read gibberish. I doubt there's much of an audience out there for that. With the exception of whoever reads Brian Herbert's works.
Or James Joyce.
Yeah, or James Joyce. But seriously, it is the gold standard. Is it entertaining to you? Is it a subject you enjoy? If you write about it, there's probably other people out there that like to read it. And sure, there's exceptions.
The hard part is just finding them.
But think about, if you really think about it, there's not many exceptions. Like the first thing you might think is, oh, well, well, go ahead.
Well, this is like one of those, okay, so there are people who are, like, actual postmodernists, and those people are crazy. But then there are people who are just influenced by postmodernists, and so they have this weird idea in their head that, like, every story's already been written, and so it doesn't really matter. I just need to subvert things, and only by subversion can I make my story good. And this results in people... This is probably a topic for a different podcast episode.
We've done this topic.
Have we done this topic?
Yes,
okay.
We've done this topic.
Then, but this is not... It is not true that every story has been written. That's only true in the most, generic definitions of the word story. So, write something that you like, and other people will probably like it as well. Unless you are a perfectly unique person, which I suspect is another thing that is another influence of postmodernism, that people want to be the unique one, but most people aren't nearly as unique as they think they are.
Yeah, I mean, you could try to write something that everyone will absolutely hate, and I guarantee you there's a crowd of 10,000 in the hentai wing just waiting for that book.
Possibly.
So yeah, attention to detail. Do it.
Attention to detail.
And be entertaining.
Yes. Like an entertainer.
Writing for the very first time?
Sure. That's what we'll close this episode with. Justin's reference to a Madonna song from 40 years ago. See y'all later, everybody. Have a good week.
Oh God, cow!
Thanks for listening to the Wordy Pair Podcast. Our passion is all things writing, world building, and getting into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We hope you enjoyed our unique takes. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe to get your weekly dose of writing weirdness. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, hit us up on Twitter. For Rudy, it's @Rudolph_Cone. And for Justin, @Ninja Mouse Chew. See you next time on the Wordy Pair Podcast.